Hi, this is Doug Schneider. Welcome back to Real Hi-Fi. In this episode, I want to talk about speaker measurements and how they pertain to the newest version of the Mission 770 loudspeaker. But before we get into the measurements thing, let me give you a bit of a history lesson. The Mission 770 loudspeaker dates back to 1978 when the company was under the control of its founder, Farid Azima. I guess after 78, various versions of the 770 followed, and the 770 became the most popular loudspeaker of all time at Mission before it was discontinued, and now brought back essentially as a reboot of the original, retaining much of the original's design aesthetic, but designed with modern know-how. That modern know-how comes from Peter Comeau, who heads the acoustic design at Mission. I had the chance to talk to Peter at Munich's high-end show in May, and I found him a fascinating individual. I learned that he's not only a speaker designer, he was an audio reviewer as well. But it was the speaker designing that really intrigued me, as it always does, so I struck up a long conversation with him about his design ideas and also what went into the 770. From all that, the thing that Peter hammered home to me was he feels that people are doing far too much looking at the measurements and far too little listening. Even designers, and this is something he believes is the downfall of some speaker designs, that ultimately you should let your ears be the judge. And this is what led the Mission 770 design program. That's not to say he didn't use measurements and he didn't use the tools that are at his disposal today. Instead, it's to say he relied on his ears, and I guess the ears of others at Mission as well, I would assume, to really guide what they wanted from the 770, because in the case of the 770 in particular, I guess there were some people call it magic, but properties of the original that they wanted to retain in this new design. And he said, you really have to listen for it. You can't just see it in the measurements, what's going to create that magic. As a result, he told me that he went through 174 crossover revisions. 174, I guess, is what's in this speaker today. And it was all done through listening. They would design the crossover, listen. Did it have the design ideals they wanted today and the magic of the old? If it didn't, they went back and redesigned it. And he believes they couldn't have gotten the magic and the sound out of this speaker strictly looking at the measurements. He said, the measurements will tell you some things, but ultimately you had to listen. Was it there? Now, whether or not they hit that target is something I still have to determine, at least a target for me. Does it sound good? Because I haven't listened to the pair long enough. But what he said really resonated with me about listening, and we talked about that a lot because I could understand where he's coming from, and he believes that people have to do more listening, not just consumers, but reviewers as well. And there's a small fringe out there of reviewing, measuring fanatics who think that they can tell the sound of a loudspeaker by looking at their charts and getting all their information from that and actually letting that guide their listening, which is really misguided. But in fact, the best speaker designers will tell you, ultimately you have to listen to the design to know if you hit the target. And why do you need to listen to them to know if you hit that target? Well, because that's what speakers are for, listening to. Measurements can tell you a lot, including if a speaker is competently designed. And with enough measurements, and when interpreted by a really skilled person, they can tell you a lot about how a speaker should sound in a room. But you won't really know till you get the speaker or a pair of speakers into a room, and this isn't really news. All the best designers know that. And I think this is really where Comeau's coming from. They had a target in their minds of what they needed to hit. a certain level of sound quality and certain sound characteristics. And these are perceptions that they had, that they heard from the speaker in the past, this magic that they're talking about. And the chart doesn't know magic. You're only going to know that from listening. So that's ultimately what they had to do, and that makes sense. So did this long talk with Peter Comeau present any revelations or change my mind about how this speaker needs to be reviewed at SoundStage? No, it doesn't affect anything at all. That's because I've long valued measurements and listening impressions, and presenting both to our readers for full information, but done separately. So the 770 is going to be reviewed in the traditional SoundStage way. All of my listening impressions will be gathered before the measurements are done in the anechoic chamber at Canada's National Research Council. This review will appear on SoundStageHifi.com in the coming months, and everything will be presented there to our readers, and they can make from it what they will, and I'm sure Comeau will be interested to see the results too. So what can you take from all this? Well, let me tell you something Dr. Floyd Toole recently said to me. For those who don't know, Dr. Toole is the man who probably did the most significant and extensive research on correlating listening impressions with speaker measurements. He said it all begins and ends with listening. And the ends with listening is what's key. Ultimately, you have to live with the speakers, listen to them, and enjoy them. So don't get hung up on chasing some sort of measurement ideal at the expense of, does it sound good to you? Obviously, that's something Peter Comeau would agree with, and why he went through 174 revisions of his crossover for this loudspeaker. Thank you for watching.